I've been talking to people since the attack here in Manchester on Thursday about all of the arrangements that we have in relation to protests. It's obviously something that's been causing some concern for some time. What's very clear to me is that there is a need to amend the law, in particular on section 12 and 14 of the Public Order Act, to make it absolutely explicit that when the police are placing restrictions or conditions on protests, they are allowed to take into account what we called cumulative disruption. That is to say, the number of protests by particular groups in particular places. Those are relevant factors for the police to take into account when they put conditions on where a protest can take place. I do think that needs to be made explicit in the law. There is an inconsistency of practice at the moment, and making it absolutely clear that this is a relevant factor for the police to take into account, I think, will strengthen the law.
So in practice, will this mean fewer repeat protests? And do you have the Gaza protests in mind when you're making these amendments?
Well, the law will apply to all types of protests, and it is designed to capture cumulative disruption. And this is about placing conditions and restrictions on where protests can take place, where they must be cited, and their duration. So those are the usual conditions that the police often place on protests.
But do you think these will apply to the Gaza protests?
Take into account cumulative. You can take into account cumulative disruption, yes.
So it is partly with the Gaza protests that you have these changes in mind?
I think we're seeing a number of different groups who are regularly protesting, and there is a cumulative impact of the disruption caused by those protests. It is not my practice to create law just for very specific circumstances, but I think what happened here on Thursday, and in conversation with people here in Manchester, but all over the country, it's clear that there is a gap in the law, there is an inconsistency of practice, and I think it is my duty to make sure that the law is exactly where it needs to be, to capture the behaviour that creates a balance between the right to protest, which is a fundamental freedom, against also public safety and wider concerns.
So just to be absolutely clear on this, do you imagine that as a result of these changes, there will be fewer protests?
What the power allows is for conditions and restrictions. So I would expect that when the changes are made, cumulative disruption is taken into account by police. They are ultimately the decision makers here, and they will be able to place restrictions and conditions on a broad range of protests, which will be caught by the measures around cumulative disruption.
I mean, some people might say, Home Secretary, that we've already in Britain at the moment got rather onerous restrictions on our right to protest. You'll be aware of the nearly 500 people who have been arrested just in the course of the last 24 hours as a result of their support for the now proscribed group Palestine Action. One of your critiques of all of this has been that it takes police resources at a time when the police are needed to provide security for some of our communities. Well, it's only because your government has banned that organisation. What is the utility? What is the utility right now in forcing the police to arrest vicars and 89-year-olds for just holding up a placard?
I'm afraid whether you're a vicar or an 89-year-old or indeed anybody else, if you're holding up a placard that is supporting a proscribed organisation, you are breaking the law of our land. And I'm afraid I have no truck with this argument that suggests that somehow police resources are better deployed elsewhere, enabling mass criminality by people who have a political point to make. It's perfectly legitimate to say that maybe you want to see the laws around proscription changed, or you have a critique of the process, but the law of our land is that supporting a proscribed organisation is against the law, and I would expect the police, rightly, to be policing those
mass
protests
criminality
and making arrests.
Mass criminality, holding up a placard.
Making arrests as required. There is no excuse for breaking the law. You wouldn't expect the Home Secretary to say anything other than the rule of law and the laws of our land must be obeyed, and those who break our law will face the full force of the law.
But you're proposing to introduce even more restrictions on people's right to protest, and you know that actually our current regime, the current administration, is receiving international condemnation from all sorts of human rights groups and the like, saying that Britain is showing signs of basically almost an authoritarian tendency in arresting people for doing nothing more than, as I say, holding up a placard.
Well, what Britain is doing is making sure that the law of our land is actually maintained. It is not holding up a placard, and I really must pick you up on that, Lewis. You are, in holding up a placard, you're breaking the law because you're supporting a proscribed, organised And just as we would not accept people holding up placards supporting Hamas or Hezbollah or any other proscribed group, the National Action and so on, the same applies to the group.
So you think it's a sensible use of police resources? You think it's a sensible use of police resources, Home Secretary, to arrest hundreds of people week after week?
I think that the police are applying the law of our land exactly as all law-abiding citizens in our country.
Yes, and some people think it's a stupid law.
Well, people can think something is stupid or not, but you do not break the laws of our land, and the police are doing the right thing exactly as I would expect and exactly as our citizens would expect.
You've described the protest which took place over the last few days as un-British. Isn't it a problem to elide British Jews in Israel? It is itself, it is often argued, that argument, a form of anti-Semitism. Therefore, given that the protesters are protesting about Gaza and not about British Jews, why is it un-British and why should they stop?
Well, actually, as a member of a minority myself, I'm not going to elide in the way that you describe British Jews with the actions of the Israeli government. That is not what I have done. What I have said is that given that this is the first time we've had a loss of Jewish life just for being Jewish in our country for many decades, if not centuries, given that there's been this horrific anti-Semitic terrorist attack on our soil, I just think that a little bit of humanity could be shown. Of course, people have the right to protest, and people have clearly gone out and protested, and the police have made sure that they've had a presence at those protests, and arrests have been made. So the law of our land is being applied. But I do think, actually, it is perfectly fair to say to people, your rights are not, you're not suddenly going to lose your right to protest if you just show a little humanity and give people a chance to grieve, especially when the community there is feeling particularly under pressure because of the scale of the protest and the feeling that Jews here are bearing a measure of responsibility for what's going on in Israel, which is also wrong. So humanity, I think, is sometimes required. These issues have been carrying on for some time. They're not about to come to an end any day soon. It doesn't look like people will be able to protest. Forbearance for a day or two, I think, would have been the right kind and British thing to do. It would have been an act of neighbourliness to our Jewish community, and I think it would have been appreciated.
What is your response, Home Secretary, to the Israeli minister inviting far-right activist Tommy Robinson to visit Israel, praising him as a courageous leader against radical Islam?
Well, it's not for me to dictate what other government ministers in other countries do or say, or who they invite. I wouldn't expect to be dictated to in terms of anybody that we, the British government, might invite into our country. I know where I stand on that particular individual. I believe he is a corrosive force in our public life. He is a convicted criminal. He's a former member of the British National Party. I think most British people get where he's coming from and actually reject utterly what he stands for.
But what would your message to the Israeli government be when they're not just inviting him, but praising him, a far-right thug, as you say, as a courageous leader against radical Islam?
Well, as I say, I'm not going to comment on what other ministers in other governments are doing. I know where we stand, where I stand, where the British government stands. We have no truck with what this individual stands for. He's a corrosive and malign influence in our politics. And I think the vast majority of people in our country rightly condemn what he stands for and will never allow his view of the world to prevail here in our own country.
But what does it say about the Israeli government that is their view?
As I say, I'm not going to say what other ministers in other governments around the world say or do, or who they invite to their country. That is for them to explain, not for me. I know where we stand.
But you could encourage them not to invite him.
I'm not going to say more than I have said. It is not for me to dictate to a foreign government who they invite to their country.
Not about dictating. You could express a view.
Respond. Well, you can ask that question of the Israeli minister if you ever get them on your show, Lewis. I know where I stand, and actually I think I know where most British people stand as well.
Just finally, Home Secretary, because I know you've got to go. Kemi Badenoch, now the Conservative Party conference is getting underway, she's suggesting a British version of the US service ICE to deport 150,000 people a year. Do you think that would be a good idea, having our own version of ICE?
Well, I think whatever the Tories have to say, whether it's on the European Convention or their newfound desire to try and find ways to remove people who have no right to be in our country, have absolutely no credibility. They had 14 years to take action. And actually, what was their record in office? Removals, That is to say, deportations and removals of people who have no right to be here actually decreased under the Tories. This government has already increased removals, and we've deported more foreign criminals from this country than the Tories in their last year of office. I don't think they have any credibility here. They've suddenly found a reforming zeal out of office. But firstly, they've got to explain why over 14 years they failed.
She's right, though, isn't she, that if we withdrew from the ECHR, it would help you deport people you don't want to be here as Home Secretary?
There will be other knock-on consequences of withdrawing from the European Convention, including the fact that it underpins quite a lot of other international agreements. So I think the question for the Tory party today is how are they going to unwind all of those agreements and renegotiate them, because these are agreements that are underpinned by the fact that we are members of the convention. It's a typical Tory trick: blame something else, say that's the reason why you failed in government, and then provide no answers for what the alternative is actually going to look like. There is a case for reform of the convention. We've already said we're going to look at Article 8. We're looking at Article 3 of the convention, as well as other conventions that we are a party to. But you can reform something whilst remaining within it and allowing it to underpin the law in all of the ways that we would expect, including returns agreements that we currently have with other countries.
Home Secretary, grateful for your time this morning. Thank you.